This video is specially for experienced Java developer preparing for Spring Boot interview at Deloitte. So in this video, I will be covering 30 real Spring Boot interview questions, not just the definitions. I will explain why this concept exists and how they are used in real Deloitte projects. So I will be referring to a real Spring Boot project so you can visualize the answer clearly. So for each and questions, I will try to explain the theoretical part first, then I will be going through the code and where this particular topic are being used. So in the interview, you can directly share this example to the interviewer and you can explain it clearly. So if you are already working in this Spring Boot projects and preparing for any kind of senior roles, and then this video is definitely for you. So before going ahead with the video, I will request you please subscribe to the channel to get videos on Java, Spring Boot, microservices, API development, interview questions, and if you want me to cover a specific topic, you can mention those on the comment section. So let's get started with the video. I have categorized the questions in 11 sections. So first sections we will be covering Spring Boot fundamentals and the architecture level. Then we will be covering Spring Boot applications, bootstrapping, then dependency injection, bin management, then REST API developments, exception handling, data access, JPA layer, then transaction security, monitoring, configuration, and then the testing. So for each and every concept, there are few questions I will be raised. Each questions I will be giving a theoretical examples, and then I will link that question to the project. So let's start with the first questions. What is Spring Boot and why do enterprises like Deloitte uses? So as you know, the Spring Boot is built on the top of Spring framework. So key problem that Spring Boot resolve is configuration complexity. So before Spring Boot, creating a Spring application requires like XML configuration, manual dependency management, and this external application server. But in this Spring Boot, it's remove all these auto configurations and embedded server, starter dependency. So think, if you go to this Spring pom.xml file, so dependencies are there and there is no XML configurations files we are writing. So we are actually configuring everything automatically. What does at the rate Spring Boot application annotations actually do internally? So Spring Boot applications is not a single features. So it combine the three more annotations like configurations, component scan, and enable auto configurations. This means that classes becomes our configuration sources and the Spring scan all the dependencies under the base package and the Spring Boot automatically configures the bin based on the class path. So let's go to this Spring Boot application interview application name. So if we see this Spring Boot applications annotation, it's being used. So if you click on this Spring Boot applications annotations, so it's internally consist of enable auto configurations, component scan, and the configuration. So whatever the packages that mentioned, so here it does not by default it scan the all the packages. So inside this com.example.interview, whatever the packages are there. So if we see this those kind of if you see controller is also this within com.example interview package. So all this object will be uh, automatically created and managed by the Spring. So that's the use of this at the rate Spring Boot applications. Next, go to the third question. So if I show you the third question, which is how does Spring Boot auto configurations work? As I was explaining, this Spring Boot auto configurations work by checking what dependencies are present in the class path. So if you go to this pom.xml file, so within this pom.xml file, so whatever the dependencies are there, for example, this Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot starter data JPA, and Spring Boot safe security, all those will be auto configured and whatever the sub dependencies are there, this will be extracted to this project. So for the examples, we have used the Spring Data JPA. So here we no need to configure like entity managers and the data sources, so those are being automatically created. So if we see this other examples like Spring Starter Web, so here using this we can create an API. So those kind of auto configuration are being done automatically. So next question is that what are the Spring Boot starter dependencies? So if we go to this pom.xml file, so if we see this Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot starter JPA, and the Spring Boot starter security, Spring Boot starter actuator. So starter dependency are actually the bundle of a lot more dependencies. So instead of configuring, so for example, this Spring Boot starter web, it contains the Spring MVC, Jackson dependency, validation dependency, embedded Tomcat. So instead of creating a dependency separately, we can actually use this Spring Boot starter web dependency. So using that, this version conflicts issue also get resolved. What is dependency injections and how does Spring Boot implement it? So dependency injection means the object should not create their dependency; they should receive them. So Spring Boot mainly uses this constructor-based injections, setter-based injections, and uh, field injections. So, but we only prefer this constructor-based injections because it's ensure this immutable dependency is easier for unit testing. So if we see in these examples, we have created this constructor of user control, and we are using or setting this service, this dot service equal to service. Doing this, we are actually doing the constructor based dependencies. Why is constructor injections preferred over field injections? As I was saying, this constructor injections make the dependencies explicit, so prevent null pointer issue and work well with the immutability, and it also support this unit testing. The next question is what is REST controller annotations and how it is different from other rate controller annotations. So REST controller is the like specialization of the controller annotations. So it's handle the HTTP request and automatically serialized Java object into JSON, eliminate the need of other rate response body annotation. So if we check one of the controller, so we have this user controller. So it has this REST controller annotation. So if I click on it, so it's already contain the controller annotations and as well as the response body. So whatever the backend applications using this API, we need to write at the REST controller, and within that class we can create the different API. The next question is how does Spring Boot convert Java object to JSON? So Spring Boot uses Jackson internally. So when a controller returns an object, so as I saw, like when this any controller returns an object, so it is returning this object called users. So then this dispatcher sublet delegates this response handling, and this HTTP message converter this convert the object, and then the Jackson serialized it into this user object into the JSON, and this all these things is happening automatically with the use of Jackson dependencies. So let's go to this next questions. What is Spring Data JPA and why it is powerful? The Spring Data JPA, it's an abstract database access. So instead of writing the boilerplate DAO code, you define the repository interface, and with that using we can use CRUD operations without any implementation. We can use pagination, sorting, we can query our own methods. So in the Deloitte, it reduces the development time and enforce the clear data access layer. So if we see this user repository, so before going to this user repository, if I show you this Spring Data JPA, so here this is the dependencies we are using, and in this repository layer, if I show you, so it is extending the JPA repository, and in this JPA repository, if you click on it, it's extending this CRUD repository, and it has like all the defaults methods like this paginations. We can from this list code repository we can get this save all methods and save methods, and this pagination we can use different like sorting technique and other things. So here we can directly make use of that instead of directly creating our own custom classes. Now next move to the next questions. And what is entity and how does ORM mapping work? So entity means that Java classes should be mapped with the database table, and each fields on the class which will be mapped with the column name from the table. So ORM allows like object level interaction and automatically SQL generations and database portability. So if we see this user entity, we have used other entity class, and we have used this id class. So table name is user, so everything id, name, email it will be matched with the table name fields of the call this user tables. And next is what is at the rate transactional and why it is critical. So as you know, this transactional ensures this atomicity, consistency, and rollback on the failures. So take an example like if an exception occurs, then all the database operation inside this particular transactions are rollback. So we can use this kind of features in our API where there is some money transaction, order processing, and some audit logging is happening. So if I show you this user service, here we are using at the rate transactional. So if this user in repository.save method, here if any operation get failed, then this particular method will also get fails. So what is next question versus eager fetching and when to use which? So a lazy fetch load data on demand, and eager fetch loads data immediately. So lazy loading improves the performance but requires open session handling. So in the interview they can come across with n+1 query problem. So you can read on that, or if you want me to make a specific video, you can comment that on the comment section. Next question is what is pagination and why it is important. So we have seen this pagination prevents like loading larger data sets into the memory. So instead of responding the every data in a single page, there is a section is there in the chunk wise it will be displaying. So in the page one like 1,000 record, page two again thousands records. So this is pagination concept is already I have shown you on this JPA repository classes. It is controller advice annotations. So it's provide the centralized exception handling. So for examples, the 2 3 controller classes are there, and those classes are throwing the same exception. Then we can use the concept of controller advice annotations. So it's handle the exception globally. Instead of creating three different exception classes, we can create one simple exception class, and we can make this the rate controller annotations. So it's like doing this, it's like consistent API error response we will be getting, and it is better logging things mechanism we can use. So how does Spring Boot handle CORS? So CORS allowed cross-domain communication. The Spring Boot provides the global configurations. In the controller layer, we can use at the rate cross origin. So with the URI, so the front-end application can easily connect to the back-end applications. Then what is Spring security and why it is needed? So if we create any application, it is definitely required to secure our applications. So we can create different configuration classes, and we can annotate with the configurations, and we can create different chain. So to depending upon the which API we can allowed without any access, which API we can allowed, we don't allow, we need some authentications. So how does this HTTP based authentications work? So, so during this HTTP based authentication, the credential are sent in the header. So in the header, we can pass this base 64 encoding, and we can pass our own tokens. So after that, it will be validated in these applications, and the person will be allowed to get the access of that HTTP method. So what is JWT and why it is preferred? So JWT is the Java based tokens. So where we can pass tokens, and within the token will be having some expiry, date and time. So it's an like stateless authentications, like no server side session storage is required, and it is preferably, we mostly prefer during the microservice based communication. Next question is that what is Spring Boot actuator and why it is important in the enterprise level applications. So Spring Boot actuator is one of the most like major features for any production application, especially most of the companies they are using. So whenever the application is running in the multiple environment, so we usually monitor we usually monitor by 24 by 7. So if anything get fails, so it would we should remind to the business. So we can use so different APIs or the URI to monitor. So we have like actuator slash health, actuator slash metrics. So those kind of API are there. So with that we can be able to monitor the applications. And the next question is that how does Spring Boot support externalized configurations? So as we seen this lot of time application.yml application.properties file. So this externalized configurations means this changing the application behavior without touching the code. So we will not change anything on the code level. So instead on the application of the properties file, we'll make the changes and we'll pass this property during this deployment, depending upon whether it is an QA properties or the dev properties or the production properties. Next question is what are Spring profiles and when do you use them? So as you know, we are using different environment to run the code. We are using dev environment, we are using QA environment, we are using the prod environment. So if we are using our testing our code locally, so we cannot run this application dot prod properties file. So that time we can run this application dot dev dot yml file. So on this app, this is the main application dot yml file. We can actually pass like argument called spring.profiles.active equal to deb. So during this the deb environment will be executed. Next question is what is the difference between component service and at the rate repository annotations? So we have seen this kind of annotations a lot of time, but as a senior developer, the interviewer want to expect more from it. So component it's like a generic bin, and the service where we use the main business logic, and repository is the for the data access layer. So if we see in our examples, we are using this the controller REST controller annotations. Then it is for any kind of API. Here, this is the class where we will write the API, and if we see this, this it is calling the service class, and service class the business logic will be written, and then it is calling the repository annotation. So if you see this user repository, so we have not written, but it's we can write at the rate repository annotations. So these are the main flow of at the rate controller, at the rate repository, and at the rate service annotations. Then how does Spring Boot handle REST API validations? So means whenever we pass any object from the JSONs, so it should automatically validate. So it should not accept like not null. If there be some specific size, so the field should be email. So those kind of allocation are already dependencies are being already provided by the Spring. So we just need to use these annotations on the top of the fields. So we can use at the rate not null. We can use at the rate like null. So it should not be the like null. So those kind of annotations we can provide, and we can validate during the input time only. How does Spring Boot embed servers like Tomcat? So Spring Boot uses this embedded server, meanings like there is no external server installation is required. We no need to provide any dependency. So these applications run as an standalone jar. Next question is that how does Spring Boot support microservices readiness? So, so even like a monolithic Spring Boot app are microservice ready because it has like embedded server, externalized configurations, that is the YML file, REST API approach is there, actuator support is there. So usually, mostly for a small scale applications, we are using monolithic. But as the time approaches or there is a requirement came, we move to the microservices applications. So next question is like how does Spring Boot support testing? So if we see, we have like a lot of test class we have created as an sample. So if you go to one of the test classes, we use a Spring Boot at the rate Spring Boot test annotation. So before that, there will be a test dependency we should be there. So it should be automatically added whenever you are creating this pom.xml file. So those kind of test we can use. So we have the question is that what is the role of applications.yml file in the Spring Boot? So as we know, this all this YML file application and they prod, those are used for the configurations and this for profiles and environment specific settings. And the last question is why is Spring Boot preferred for enterprise developments? As we gone through those sessions, so we came to know this Spring Boot is preferred because of its faster development, production readiness, strong ecosystem, and it's have the community support, auto configurations. Those are a lot more features are there. You can mention that. So thank you for watching the video. I request you please subscribe to the channel and please provide the feedback on the comment section. And all the best for your interview.